Digimon's newest restriction list dropped at 4:30 AM on Saturday, but rather than jump at a video immediately, I wanted to process and consider why Bandai made some of these choices. And this video not only goes over what the newest restrictions are, but the justifications, substitutions for the deck, and how you as a player can move forward in preparation for Bandai Card Games Fest. First and foremost, the newest restriction list is the most cards that have ever been put on the restriction list. Prior to this, the last one added 8 cards, with 1 pair restriction. And with so much information to talk about, let's dive right into it. For the singular ban of this restriction list, Bandai did it. Sayo Koh has hit the restriction list at 0 copies. This card has been oppressive, especially in Galaxy Loop decks that can steal back turns by simply playing a Digimon. Whether you're using the traditional variant and controlling the board with Hexablaumon, or the newest variant that had Rise Greymon, it's all over for these types of decks. In regards to substitutions, most of the decks that utilize this card for the archetype have already built it into new Digimon or Tamers. So if you're playing CS Dianamon or Galaxy, you're covered. But the loop itself is effectively gone. Following up the singular ban on the new list, we also lost 1 pair ban interaction for another. Chaosmon Valderarm has officially been banned from being in the same deck as BT17 Taomon or Sakuyamon X. And the reasoning is ultimately very simple. Taomon is able to use an option card with plugin in its name, or is yellow from the hand with its cost reduced by 2. Meaning with Digivolution plugin S, or Yellow Scramble, you were effectively able to climb into Sakuyamon, who would likely do the same thing, and go into Valderarm. Sakuyamon X in particular further provided aggro conditions, one in which you could play a rush token, and the other you could attack with this Digimon, and then use the same type of option cards without paying the cost. And although Yellow Scramble might only reduce Valderarm's 5 cost to only 2 memory, the fact that you could potentially have 2 level 6s in the stack also makes this free. Now without these cards, you will be forced to conduct this strategy with a little bit more risk, with cards like Taomon Ace, and if you're wanting to get 2 sources underneath, it's exploring Maid Mode as an option. But to be fair, to continue trying this combo means you have less options, as one of the plugins was also restricted. Keep in mind, the purpose of utilizing Sakuyamon X is purely for that unsuspend, and although Valderarm might not be as effective, you still have Shine Greymon Ruin mode for control. Which takes this video into the real nitty-gritty elements with the restrictions. To no one's surprise, Gravity Crush has been hit to 1. This was expected because a lot of Red OTK decks were using this. Red Hybrid was one of the first decks to use it, and then Megidramon and Megidramon Birds took over. If you want memory, you're now going to need to go back to Memory Boost, which telegraphs to your opponent what you're doing. But will Floodgates be relevant? I still don't think so, because Megidramon decks can still preemptively delete them before they climb the whole chain. Interestingly, Bandai did make a preemptive strike on one other option card in the form of Parabolic Junk. And while some players are scratching their heads on this one, ultimately I've perused a few ways that this could be used, such as in Sendromon decks and Pawn Chessmon, in which you can Parabolic the level 3 because it does have black in the color sources, and then after you overclock, you could pull back the turn to do another instance of overclock when you pass turn. While limited in application, I feel that there are ways to potentially even self-delete with other methods. But this is again something that Bandai wanted to avoid. Now with Tropical Venom left, this is the only 0-cost option card that can gain you memory that still exists. But its use hinges on a few things, such as your opponent having a Digimon in play, and you being able to tack into it at the end of turn. Vortex is the only keyword at this time which can really abuse this, but Bandai has chosen to overlook it. Only time will tell if this option will join the rest. Following these 2 options though, we start getting into the archetypal restrictions. Ultimately, these 3 cards now on screen were the chosen offenders for Megidramon in addition to Gravity Crush. With now only Rush Guilmon at 1 copy, this makes it fundamentally harder to have multiple of them out when Megidramon self-deletes in the same turn that Growlmon X was digivolved into. Whether you hit this or the Growlmon X was one of the big contentious questions for me. And while many fans are wondering why Growlmon X was left alone, and instead EX3 Growlmon was limited to 1, Bandai will likely provide a clearer explanation in the coming days, but I can assume a few things. Because while this Growlmon can delete a Digimon with 3000 DP or less, it can also trash the top 2 cards of both players' decks if nothing was deleted. But while you may think that this is similar to the BT21 variant, multiple copies of this Growlmon can do 4 cards each time you digivolve into it, and with multiple Guilmons for instances, could be fueling the trash more quickly for a secondary attack wave. The BT21 variant does have a higher DP deletion threshold, but only ever trashes 2 cards, which means it's fulfilling the conditions for War Growlmon's effect at half the rate. Trust me, I'm a firm believer that Growlmon X was an equal offender, but I also feel like this list leaned more into Japan's meta because of their explosive high-roll best-of-1 formats. That being said, I do not have quantifiable evidence that suggests Megidramon's presence in the West was the same as Megidramon birds. In my limited exposure with commentary, it feels like I've seen more pure Megidramon than the bird variant. But ultimately for players who enjoyed playing pure Phoenixmon X, regrettably this is where Garurumon X is going to take a straight bullet because of its ability to grant generically your red Digimon Rush. That Your Turn effect was pivotal in giving you Rush bodies whenever a red card was returned to the hand, even with its when Digivolving effect or on-play effect. Not to mention, this card has an identical inheritable to the weregarurumon of BT21, in which you trash your opponent's top security card. And while this interaction was completely unintended, Bandai is still looking at ways to improve their game. The card pool at this point exceeds over 3,200 cards, and at times it can be difficult to know how every card will react to each other. And while I still feel Garurumon X should have been limited, ultimately, it might survive for now and be on the next one. Moving back to Sakuyamon decks, Sakuyamon took a lot of hits this restriction list, one in the form of a pair ban, and then 2 restricted cards. Other than not being able to use Valderarm with Taomon and Sakuyamon X, you now have to contend with only having one copy of Digivolution Plugin S and BT19 Sakuyamon. For players, you might consider using the win rate 60% as another means to reduce Digivolution costs, though this is a net -2 from hand when using the option card, and also sacrificing a Digimon card of the specific color to Digivolve into. It's not an exact 1-for-1, and because it's not plugin named, you will either need a color source or a tamer to use it. Likewise, the restriction of Sakuyamon is mainly for the fact that using your option cards means that your hand inherently decreases. This variant of Sakuyamon, while more recent, is able to net you 2 additional cards throughout the process, which can help you find more of those options to accelerate into that level 7. While the EX2 variant doesn't draw you more cards, it does allow you to get that unsuspend, and you're able to return 1 option card with plugin in its name from your trash to hand for each tamer you have in play. Its overall effects aren't necessarily as defensive or aggro, but for a small stepping stone, it might be necessary. The restrictions to Sakuyamon for me are largely unavoidable. There were unintended card interactions, and ultimately if you limited Valderarm, you're unintentionally punishing Excel. But for the number of restrictions, I do feel that it was on the harsher side comparatively to say Megidramon and Megidramon birds. In regards to Royal Knights, Bandai ultimately didn't hit omekamon, or Omnimon X, or Last Guardian like many players I saw in their own restriction videos. Instead, they only chose 1 card in the form of Royal Knights of the Purge. And this is a great hit from my perspective. With multiple King Drasil in the sources, this option could be effectively 3 memory, and so on turn 3, assuming you went first, you could have used this option card once or twice already to accelerate your endgame plan. Remember, this option card places 1 Digimon card in the hand under your King Drasil in the breeding area, meaning your on-play reduction would be 7 at minimum with King Drasils, or at the best case scenario, 12 to 14. Meaning your Omnimon play could be already live. At the moment, I've been playtesting substitutions with BT13 omekamon, but this Digimon must be deleted in order to place a Royal Knight underneath it. In addition, the BT20 omekamon also makes great fodder, and both of these Digimon can be played by Leopardmon Ace's effect. Do I think Royal Knights could have used more restrictions? Possibly, but at the same time, I think this is the most justified hit, unless you want players to be kneecapped off BT13 Omnimon and focus only on Omnimon X. Not to mention, this would hurt the sales of the Last Knight P Bandai set. And with only 1 restriction card left, I'm mixed on this one because the target was Garurumon Alter S, a deck that only recently made waves in the Digimon community news, particularly in the East. Briefly, this combo hinged on drawing multiple cards from your deck with various Gabumons and Garurumon cards, before climbing into weregarurumon Sagittarius mode. Because when you play Blitzgreymon Ace, you can Digivolve into EX1 Metal Garurumon to pull back the memory and then simultaneously use Blitzgreymon Ace's end of turn effect to DNA Digivolve into Omnimon Alter S. The problem was, when you attacked with Alter S to fully resolve Blitzgreymon Ace's end of turn effect, you'd be able to spit out the weregarurumon Sagittarius mode and Blitzgreymon Ace again in order to loop the combo. Traditionally, restriction lists have normally covered decks from the last 6 months format, but this deck in particular seems to have been more recent in literally the last month. And rather than leave it to play in the current format, Bandai went ahead and took an axe to it. Which kind of stinks considering EX1 was getting some value bumps in recent weeks because of this card. But if you're still wanting to play this deck, there are ways to gain more memory with BT5 Metal Garurumon, or just unsuspend it if you want to do more damage. Overall, While I heavily agree with the majority of these restrictions, pair bans, and bans, my disagreements predominantly fall more in line with the matter that when Bandai does try to rebalance the game with these restrictions, these lists are more tailored towards the metadata that is observed with our players of the East. Don't get me wrong, I do think EX1 weregarurumon would have been more problematic in the future, but I will call it now that in the next 6 months, I could realistically see cards like Miraculous Mega Knight and Omnimon Alteress being potential candidates for being restricted to 1. But the point that I do want to make here is that our players in the East continue playing a best of 1 format, which means what works over there in a high roll situation may not be indicative of a deck that can consistently take 2 out of 3 games in a best of 3 scenario. To that end though, I do have a few final concerns in regards to the restriction list. If a problematic card is removed, why are the Band-Aid fixes still on the list? BT2 Gabumon, for example, suffered for its role that combined with Eismon Scatter Mode, made a Pokemon decks absolutely silly. BT11 Mirage Gaugamon was also hit to 1 because of its potency in Galaxy Loop decks. But now with Sayo Koh restricted, is it that bad of an idea to bring Mirage Gaugamon back to 4 copies? To some players, Mirage Gaugamon had its time, and the deck should only come back when Bandai decides to print a new variant that makes it powerful enough to thrive in a competitive setting. But for others who really loved Mirage, with Sayo Koh gone now, they just want to play their favorite tribal deck again. Even looking at the history of the Digimon card game throughout the years, there have been a few cards that were restricted and have been unrestricted. BT6 Savior Huckmon and Tommy Himi were some of the first cards that got the unrestriction status after going to jail. And even more recently, the Starter Deck 6 Gabumon also managed to get away, despite being one of the few purple cards that has a draw 1 trash 1 inheritable that is not once per turn. Ultimately, this final aspect of discussion is to be a food for thought in that do you want previous cards unrestricted that no longer hold a candle to the current meta? Or do you feel Bandai simply ignores cards already on the restriction list because the focus isn't on what has been printed, but what will be printed in future sets? While Parabolic Junk hasn't made any big ripples in the competitive scene, Bandai hitting this particular card now is definitely an example of future-proofing certain interactions. What are your thoughts on today's video in regards to the restrictions, substitutions, and why Bandai might have made the decisions that they did? Did this list negatively affect any of your decks or sales and purchases in recent weeks? Let me know in the comments, and I'll catch you on more Digimon content this week. This DIGI-PANDA, logging out.